back, Year 12. Thank you for the amazing work that you did last week, looking at Black people in Britain before and during the Second World War. This lesson, we're going to look at what life is like for Black people in Britain after the Second World War, focusing on our inquiry on how have Black people struggled against injustice in the 20th century. So one important relationship for people from the Caribbean was their relationship with the police force. And if we're looking at their relationship with the police force in the 1950s, what was it that they expected? And we're going to watch this short clip, which is two people from the Caribbean talking about what their parents said to them about their time in Britain, so offering some advice to them before they came and made the journey to Britain.
You know, when I came to this country, I was told, if you get lost or if you have any problem, just go to a policeman. You know, you would not ask anybody directions. You would go to a policeman because you see them as nice people.
What was the Caribbean woman's expectation about the police force in London?
She expected that they would actually look after her. Yeah, that they'd be welcoming. I think, well, we know that when people came in, like Caribbean immigrants came into the UK, they had higher expectations, well, unrealistic expectations of what it would be like for when they got here. Yeah, which has been showed by what the woman has been saying. Because she obviously expected a much warmer welcome than what she would most probably have gotten.
And what do you think about that idea of her, like as a Black woman going to a police officer if she's in danger in contemporary Britain today?
Idealistic.
Why?
Because you'd like to hope that you could go to a policeman and they would be helpful. But it's not always the reality.
And I mean, she would probably be more in danger with a police officer than any other person because the police officer has that authority and that power to do essentially whatever they want to do to the woman. So yeah.
Yeah, and how many deaths have we seen in Britain at the hands of police officers? Yeah. So it's interesting because I think now the police are symbols of fear, whereas there it's a symbol of hope and protection. Although, was it always like that? So this is actually an extract from Sir Robert Peel, the person who created the police in Britain, and essentially it was to try and prevent crime from happening in the streets. And this is an extract from the act which brought the Metropolitan Police into existence. So we're going to have a little read of this extract, and I want us to think, do these ideas support the optimism in this woman's perspective and the perspective of Black people in their view of the police? So the act said, the police seek and preserve public favour, not by catering to public opinion, but by constantly demonstrating absolutely impartial service to the law, in complete independence of policy and without regard to the justice or injustice of the substance of individual laws, by ready offering of individual service and friendship to all members of society without regard to their race or social standing, by ready exercise of courtesy and friendly good humour. What do you think about that extract? Anything in particular that stood out to you?
I mean, it explicitly says there shouldn't be any bias or prejudice towards someone based on their race or social standing. I mean, it uses the word friendship, and I guess that's very, very different to what they actually did with their power. And what the law is saying is that police officers should be part of the community, and they should be nice, and they should be opening and welcoming. And I guess that's what they weren't. They weren't to that. That's the reality.
And I think it's just interesting that this source from the 19th century, the beginning of the 19th century, is explicitly addressing race and saying that you shouldn't be treating anybody differently because of their race. When's the next time we see a law like that in this country?
This idea of welcoming people, because obviously the Windrush invited people. It said, we are going to welcome you with open arms. This law is saying exact that, like, we are going to protect you. You're going to be within sort of like the mother country's grasp, and we're going to help you. We'll come to know that that's not the reality. So of course, you know, this woman is optimistic because she's hopeful that she has the protection of the law, the welcoming feeling that she was getting from the government that was inviting her to come over. So it's interesting how all of that friendship and protection and, you know, sort of hospitable welcome, it bit by bit is sort of lost.
So in reality though, so that was the expectation, the idea that the police would protect you. But then something kicks off in Notting Hill, which you looked at a little bit in your GCSEs, and that was the Notting Hill riots in 1958. So what actually happened in Notting Hill? So we'll just watch a short clip, and I want us to consider when we're watching this clip, what were the problems behind the racial violence that broke out in Notting Hill in 1958?
The day before the riot started, you got a bloke named Ramon and his wife, we know her as Tanya. They had a fight, and white people didn't like it, so they went to help her out. Eventually, she's turned on them and started to fight them. So they said, we turn on them own people against them.
This single incident was to set up an explosion of white anger the following night.
Saturday night now I was having this dance, and we heard like a swarm of bees coming. Although the music was playing loud, we could hear the noise from outside. So I went to the top door and looked out, and I saw some mass people, a lot of people coming, with a police van in front, a dog hanger in front of the van. And when they reached where the music was playing, they just stopped. And with so much people, they couldn't control them. They started throwing bricks and like that in the building.
I looked through the 5th floor window where I was, and there was a battle between black men, policemen, white yobos and teddy boys. I mean, the street wasn't lighted except for fires and that Molotov cocktails. So, it was everywhere. And that night's riot would be just the opening salvo.
Something new and ugly raises its head in Britain. Racial violence. An angry crowd of mules chases a Negro into a greengrocer's shop, while police reinforcements are called up to check the riot, one of many that have broken out here in a few days. The injured victim, a Jamaican, is taken to safety.
For the following 6 weeks, black homes were targeted by mobs night after night. An eyewitness to the riots was newspaper columnist Mervyn Jones.
One went round in the early evening, soon after it got dark, and then you would see a bunch of youngsters, I estimated age 16 to 20, a bunch of youngsters running through the streets with petrol bottles, usually a beer bottle or something filled with petrol and with a piece of felt sticking out of it. And when they got to where they knew black people were living, they would smash the window and they would chuck it through the window and start a fire.
What caused this outbreak of racial violence in Notting Hill in 1958?
The existence of interracial couples and the fear that black people were going to turn white people against each other.
Excellent. Right. So what specifically happened at the beginning?
So there was an interracial couple that were having an argument, and a group of white people came in to defend a white woman, and then she turned against them.
Just add to that as well, the idea of if you have an interracial couple, you're going to have interracial children, and those children are then going to be classified as obviously being black, which means that the black population is going to intensify. So there's that fear of like, there's going to be an uncontrollable amount of black people in England now. So, yeah.
It's black peril, essentially.
Can you explain what that means, black peril?
When white people are afraid of black people taking over, being with their white women, creating more black babies, and essentially they're afraid that they're going to get revenge and do unto them what they did to the black people.
Yeah, excellent.
Yeah.
So Go on, Giovanna.
Didn't Afrikaners see it as like the black onslaught?
Yeah.
They phrased it in that way, yeah. The first black domination.
So it's a term that's used in South Africa, but I think the sentiment and the fears are still the same kind of things there. So excellent, good link to it. So they went to a place where people were dancing. So one of the things which happened during this time period were, because obviously it was perfectly legal to be racist. There was no law saying that racism is illegal. You had the right to discriminate based on colour. And essentially, in terms of this experience for Black people in Britain, it meant that they were refused housing on the basis of their skin colour, and they refused jobs on the basis of their skin colour. So that's like an economic suffering that they went through. But then there's also that social suffering as well, in the sense that they weren't allowed into white entertainment spots. They weren't allowed into pubs. They weren't allowed into clubs. So as a result, what started to happen was you started to have people having massive house parties in their flats instead. And this is why this group of white people decide to target one of those parties. But the only reason why they have to exist in that capacity is because they're barred from everywhere else. So it's called the colour bar.
One of, just to link in sort of financial and the social, is that one of the things that they used to do is throw these house parties to help raise money for rent. So they would literally have a house party, you'd pay a little bit to get in, and then that person would have enough money to pay rent. So it's this idea of supporting one another, which is building into what Ms. McCone is saying.
And what about the shameful episode? I think that's a really interesting title of that news report. It's called The Shameful Episode. What was it? What actually ensued in the Notting Hill riots? What did that look like?
Chaos. I mean, they just wreaked havoc, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Like they were saying, they would get like beer bottles and stuff, and they'd like smash windows of black houses. Yeah.
Yes, that's called a Molotov cocktail.
Yeah, someone referred to it as a battle, which was interesting.
Yeah. Well, actually, what does a battle suggest as a metaphor?
I mean, there's just like one part of it, and like that there's a greater war to be fought.
Oh, I didn't think about that. Yeah, true. But that there's two sides fighting. Does this seem like two sides are fighting each other?
No, it's one side attacking the other, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's just pure terror for the black people in Notting Hill, which is so local and close to us as well. So it's a time of terror. You have people throwing Molotov cocktails into houses. So basically the alcohol makes it more flammable. And then when you throw it and the liquid spreads, then the fire spreads across the house as well. So really painful. You had teddy boys going around and hitting people with bicycle chains, and just untold violence and chaos. And that lasted for 6 weeks. So the question is, where were those police that were supposed to protect them? And another development of this is the rise of somebody called Oswald Mosley. So we're going to learn a little bit about him by watching this clip and think, what was the likely impact of this gentleman, Oswald Mosley, on the situation in Notting Hill in 1958?
An even more sinister force was at work. Sir Oswald Mosley's anti-immigrant union movement had been campaigning in Notting Hill since 1956. Mosley had become notorious in the 1930s as the leader of Britain's fascists. Discredited during the war for his support of Hitler, he saw Notting Hill as the chance to relaunch his political career.
Mosley jumped on the whole black dimension during and after the riots and said to ordinary English working class people, it's time to wake up and don't let your country be taken over.
By July of 1958, the resentment exploited by Mosley had turned the streets of Notting Hill into a dangerous place for West Indians.
What impact is Oswald Mosley going to have in Notting Hill?
I mean, he's obviously going to encourage the white rioters to continue and to even intensify their rioting and their attack on the black community. And I mean, things that are happening now in our political climate is very reminiscent of things that he stood up for. Maybe not as overt. I mean, but even with the rise of populism, you see how far-right leaders have been mobilizing working class communities with the sentiment of anti-immigrant, racist, and it's kind of terrifying how that's still not checked and counterattacked, I guess, by the authorities.
I think that's one of the saddest things I found studying history, and the more history that I learn. I think I used to believe that we learn history to not repeat the mistakes of the past. But what I found the more I've learned is realizing how often we haven't repeated those mistakes of the past. And it's not a story of progress at all. It's a story of cycles.
Yeah, very true.
And it's like these teddy boys are continuously going out. They're going on these hunting sprees, trying to find black people. And what Mosley is able to do is sort of legitimize that voice, and it actually gives him a forum to be able to do what they're doing. So while they're out, like his foot soldiers, doing what he intends for them, he's the one that's speaking on their behalf. He's the one that's in the media and gaining that legitimacy. And it's only getting worse.
And just this idea, like, you look quite surprised, Giovanna, actually, when you saw he was the British Union of Fascists. Why were you surprised by that?
I mean, it's not that long after World War II.
Yeah.
And the British prided themselves with the idea that they won the war, they saved the Jewish people, they killed Hitler. Yet there's someone in their own country that's doing the same thing and just continuing that rise of fascism. It's a bit scary, you know?
And he was popular as well. A lot of people did support him. He organised riots and marches. You have something to look up that's incredibly interesting is the Battle of Cable Street. And that's when you had a fascist march, so led by Oswald Mosley, marching through Cable Street, which was a very Jewish town. And we had what we would call now the Antifa. And they basically went and stopped it. It was like a counter-protest. So I think that's something that's always quite interesting about British history. There's multiple sides and multiple faces to it. There's the face of people like that and people who support him, but then there's also the face of people standing up against these ideas. But
that was in 1936.
Yeah.
Scary.
I was going to say, so the police were not really participating in the riots. They weren't helping. So what might the Black British experience be with the police now? From that optimism that those two women at the start of the lesson was saying, how do you think, would it stay the same? Would it change?
I feel like they would have had feelings of like betrayal, confusion, because they came to this country expecting so much and received nothing. So I feel like that would have been really confusing at first. I don't think they would have held on to hope for much longer, considering how bad the riots were and how little the police were doing.
Police, when we went to the hospital and the police came, they told us the only way we can avoid these things happening to us is to go back where we come from. The police themselves, we did not see them as upholders of law. They took sides, and they didn't take sides with us. We see them as a part of the enemy because that was their behavior. And so we had clashes even with the police themselves. And out of that riot, without any question, it was quite plain that there was nobody protecting us, so we had to protect ourselves.
What was the impact then of the Notting Hill riots and Black British expectations of the police?
I guess it was that realization that they were alone in all of this, and that, like the man said, that if they wanted protection, they had to take it. They had to do it themselves.
What did the police officer say to him?
I mean, that famous phrase that we still continue to hear to this day: "Go back to where you came from." You invited them here. But sure, okay, that makes sense.
And it's the fact that he says as well, the gentleman says they were the enemy. They became a part of the enemy. So their protectors, their guardians, their people that were supposed to look out for them have now become a part of the problem.
Yeah. And I just feel like it's so heartbreaking to think that people are still coming to that same realization how many years later. Like, there's still that feeling of like hurt and anger and betrayal because the people that are literally meant to protect you aren't. And they're doing the opposite. They're contributing to a system that works against you and that works for your downfall. Watching that, it's just like, it doesn't feel like I'm watching something, a part of a history lesson. It feels like I'm watching the news right now.
Why?
Because it's the perfect reflection of the current climate that we're experiencing. And it's so frustrating because people continue to talk about how much progress we've made. But, I mean, not to discredit the progress that has been made, because there has been progress, obviously, and so many people have done so much for us. But, like, seriously, I almost feel at a loss for words because it's so frustrating. And, yeah, I'm not going to get too emotional.
I mean, get emotional, man, it's fine. But I think if you can't go to the police, if you're in danger, who can you go to? No one, right? And that's terrifying. And it's not even just the idea that you can't go to them when you're in danger, but the idea they have impunity and that they can actually harm you and get away with it too. So that's scary. And I think this is a very clear moment that we can see not long ago in our history where Black lives just don't matter. They don't matter to the police to defend them. They don't matter to the government to force the police to defend them either.
And even I know. Oh, sorry, Miss. You can go. I know we're talking about the UK, but I was listening to the audiobook, The New Jim Crow, and her name is Michelle, and she was saying how once the police have you in custody and you're in prison, then they have the legal right to be racist towards you. They have the legal right to discriminate towards you. And that's the same here. Like, once you're under the power of the police and they can essentially do whatever they want with you, and that's where the danger comes from.
Yeah. Just to add on to that, in the 13th Amendment, it says that nobody can be held as a slave except as a punishment for crime. Once you are in police custody, they can do whatever they want with you. And like you said, Macomb, they have impunity. Like, they can get away with it. I know here in the UK, there's a committee, the Independent Office for Police Conduct. And if you ever want to make a complaint against a policeman, policewoman, it is essentially a committee of ex-police people that review that case. And so more times than not, police are let off the hook in this country to this day.
I was just going to comment into what Giovanna was saying earlier on, the idea of like go back to where you came from. So with the Windrush generation, when they came over and they, I guess, reality hit in and they weren't getting what they were promised, many of them did actually try to go back. Many of them couldn't afford the ticket to go back. Many of them were actually too ashamed of going home empty-handed after they had spent so much money coming here. So just even, I mean, they have every right to stay in England, but even the ones that did want to go back didn't have that option. And so many of them did feel the sense of entrapment where they can't go home, they're stuck here, and they're being heavily discriminated against the people, as we said, supposed to protect them or not. So it's kind of like they didn't know where to go. It's a sense of entrapment, which is very sad.
Yeah, I guess it's that story of immigration, and like you said, that you come to a country with so much hope and so many plans for success and to help your family back home, and then, like you said, for them to leave empty-handed, it kind of made them feel ashamed, but it wasn't their fault. It was the people who invited them and the people who brought them over basically discarded all the dreams that they had and lied about everything they told them that they were going to do for them.
So this is an extract from the judge's statement in the trial of 9 white youths. So 9 white youths were arrested and they were accused of being the people who incited the violence. So we're going to have a little read of this extract, and I want us to think about the justice, so the judge, Justice Salmon, and how far does his statement show that Black British people got justice in Notting Hill in 1958?
It was you then who started the whole of this violence in Notting Hill. You're a minute and insignificant section of the population who have brought shame upon the district in which you live, and have filled the whole nation with horror, indignation, and disgust. I am determined that you and anyone anywhere who may be tempted to follow your example shall clearly understand that crime such as this will not be tolerated in this country, but will inevitably meet in these courts with the stern punishment which they so justly deserve. It's kind of surprising, not gonna lie. Was he a white justice? I mean, that's a bit of a silly question, but he was white, wasn't he?
Yes, he was white. Why did you ask that question though? It's a good question. Why?
Because it's surprising that white youths were held accountable for what they did. I mean, it's just that simple. The fact that they were accused of inciting it, and they were hopefully punished accordingly for what they did.
And how does he view that crime that they did?
As intolerable in this country, he says. And he understands that it was wrong, it was completely wrong and inhumane, everything that they did.
Even the idea of sort of shame, like you are an embarrassment to your, it says district, but the idea of you're an embarrassment to your country, like this is what you've done. It's quite interesting for him to use such a sort of emotion-evoking word, because that has so much connotations.
Does that feel like justice?
I mean, when I think of justice, I think that there's two sides to justice. There's a side of where the people who committed the crime and the atrocity are punished accordingly, but also justice to the victims. And so this just represents one side of justice, of them being held accountable. But I think it depends what the community did to help the black community and to help them come out of Notting Hill, of the riots. Because it doesn't just come with physical damage like to their property, but also comes with the trauma and the horror and like the feelings of betrayal that everyone was talking about. So I think there's two sides to justice, and this is just represents one side of justice.
No, I was thinking in my head how that linked, Giovanna's explanation of justice linked really well to the so-called end of apartheid, in the sense that there was a black president and, things are looking good in that sense, but then there hasn't been a redistribution of wealth, hasn't been a redistribution of land, no one has been held accountable, no one has faced any time. And it also reminds me of Haiti, in the sense that they got rid of slavery, but then they had to rebuild their country whilst paying off a debt to France, which has left them in an awful state. There are a lot of correlations. There are a lot of examples that we could probably list, but I think that was a really good point. I didn't think of it like that.
Do you think this might give Black British people, hope? Because once this has been set, once this decision is made, it's set as precedent. So do you think this might restore their faith in the justice system in England, or do you think they've given up on it by this point? This is in 1958 I'm talking about.
I don't think this is enough, in the sense that this is a statement from one person. And it's a really good statement. It's amazing. I'm sure people appreciated it, obviously, but lives were lost, homes were damaged, families were torn apart. It's not sufficient. It's nowhere near enough. So I don't think it would have been able to. I don't think it was enough to restore their faith in the system.
And is this going to solve the problem? So just saying the whole violence was a result of these 9 white youths, they should be punished.
No, because it wasn't just 9 people. It was masses of people that joined in. This violence was as a result of racist beliefs that are embedded within British society, within British culture, I guess. So 9 people weren't the problem. The problem was the system. The problem is the beliefs that the system is built on.
Just building off what Heaven was saying, maybe it was these 9 youths who incited it, but just because they're being held accountable doesn't mean that the ideas and the hatred from the white community has gone away with just the accountability of these 9 youths. And so unless the whole system is addressed, and unless these I would say national feelings of national sentiments of hatred towards the Black communities are addressed, then justice won't really be achieved, and that's why justice still hasn't been achieved in the British community, and that's why there's still inherent racism in all institutions.
And I think it's so important that you mentioned that it was the idea, because again, to link it back to South Africa, Sobukwe was deemed as the most dangerous man in South Africa because of the idea that he had, the idea of like Pan-Africanism and Black pride and Black power. The idea is so much more powerful than the person. And so because that idea is still so potent and widespread within British society, like Giovanna said, it's a nationwide problem. It's not limited to 9 people.
Yeah, and that idea can be just as powerful on the other side. I mean, look at Hitler and the ideas of fascism.
Actually, it's very interesting that you say that, because a lot of the historians who write about this period try to make sense of what happened, and one of the biggest failings was the lack of pro-Caribbean sentiment from the government, pro-Caribbean propaganda and education. There was nothing to calm and ease the fears of British people, because there are legitimate fears in the idea that you're going to lose your job, you're going to be undercut, but it's nonsense, it's not true. So if there had been more information explaining that and educating the public, a lot of these racist moments in British history wouldn't have really happened. And that's the issue, it's the idea, and it's a really powerful way to put it. This is Kelso Cochrane. So the Notting Hill riots happened in 1958. There's more injustice in the streets of Notting Hill in 1959 when Kelso Cochrane is murdered. So he's murdered. He's a carpenter from the Caribbean, and he was just walking home from work, and he essentially left behind a fiancée, and he's stabbed and killed. So when somebody's murdered, what's the usual thing that happens with the police?
There's an investigation. So they try to find the murderer, and then they arrest the murderer.
Yeah. So when murder happens, that's justice being served, isn't it? The idea that the police will do everything in their power to find the murderer. So what actually happened for Kelso, and what was the police response to his death?
Racial crime was to remain a threatening feature of life in Britain. In May 1959, just 8 months after the riots, Notting Hill again made national news when a West Indian carpenter named Kelso Cochrane was stabbed to death by 3 teddy boys.
What does it suggest actually about the justice in the judge's comments?
It was superficial.
Yeah, why?
Because no real change came about. Like we said, they arrested 9 guys. They didn't arrest the idea. They didn't stop the idea.
Yeah, excellent.
It was Britain's first acknowledged race killing.
He was attacked by 3 teddy boys. They asked him for money. And he turned his pocket out and said to them, "Look, I ain't got no money." So we take him at the back, and one fronted him. And yeah, he got it right in his chest. And when I lose him, it was like losing myself.
Why did the bloke get killed for no reason at all? Not for money, but here's another blackie, let's get him. That was it.
No one was ever arrested for Kelso Cochrane's murder, leaving many in the Black community to conclude that they could expect little protection from the law.
It was a moment when people realized how vulnerable they were, for one thing. You know, that is, Black people realize how vulnerable they were.
You know, when I came to this country, I was told, if you get lost, or...
Why was the death of Kelso Cochrane a significant death in the UK?
Well, the video clearly said that it was the first acknowledged racial murder in Britain, but that was mostly by the public rather than authorities. And it's interesting that they use the word that acknowledged. it's happened before, but this one was probably so public and so outraging that it had to be acknowledged now. Like, they passed a point where they could like try and cover it up, even though they probably did try and cover it up, but like it was already out in the public, it was out in the media, and so it had to be acknowledged.
I think actually something that's interesting that you just made me think of is that there definitely were racially motivated murders prior to this. The difference is, though, this happens after Notting Hill. And what Notting Hill acted like was a catalyst, a moment of consciousness for the people of the Caribbean in London, because it's the moment when they realise that they need to organise. And that's what they start doing around Kelso.
I mean, it's kind of like Emmett Till's murder in America and Sharpeville in South Africa. Like the point where the moral searchlight was placed on the authorities.
So it's the same as that moral searchlight. It's a very good term to use. So why is it that the police work so hard to deny it as a racially motivated murder?
We just read that statement from one of the justices, and I guess they probably try and cover up to make it seem like, oh, it's okay, we've solved the issue, you know, like it can't be racially motivated. We already arrested those 9 boys. The problem solved. Like, it's something else. And so, like, the idea of them not addressing that it's inherent and that they have to discredit the ideas and the sentiments nationally rather than just arresting those 9 boys, like Kevin said earlier.
Very true.
It's quite interesting in terms of like, this also becomes sort of like a huge change in dynamics between the Caribbean community in West London and also the working class community in West London, because they are living in the same area. These teddy boys are essentially coming from the white working class, and so those hostilities are intensifying drastically. So it's not just the police force, it's the class structure also in England that is adding sort of like fuel to the fire.
Couldn't you say that's like also interclass conflict, because I guess the Caribbeans would have probably been in the working class, and so like whilst there was that like stereotype of the working class being against the rich and the bourgeoisie, it's kind of the opposite here, is where more of like a civil war but within class structures, within the same class.
Yeah, exactly. And I think as well, like, this idea of people from the Caribbean being in London, and this idea of the Caribbean community. And if we're thinking about the Caribbean, it is a collection of islands, all with unique identities and unique ideas. So somebody from Jamaica wouldn't see someone from Trinidad as their brother, for example. They wouldn't see that as somebody they want to fight with or fight for. And they viewed themselves as Jamaican, as from being from Barbados and so forth. And what Notting Hill and this death of Kelso represented and really was powerful was that it created this important mobilization of that community, something which Claudia Jones was very instrumental in. And she tried to give a voice to that community as well through uniting it through a common ideas through the West India Gazette, which was a newspaper that was created for West Indians living in London to try and formulate ideas and build further that community as well. You have this, and so there is a letter of protest from the black community in response to this, saying Kelso Cochrane was murdered because he was coloured. African and West Indians are bitter over the murder of one who, but for the grace of God, might have been any one of us. Are we to be mauled down just because we are black? Why is it actually important for the black community that this is acknowledged as a racial murder?
The first step for any problem to be solved is for it to be acknowledged as an actual problem. If people don't see something as a problem, then they're not going to try and work towards a solution.
So it's about mobilizing behind that and trying to just get people talking about it. It's still a problem which is so infuriating right now. People do not talk about race. People will say, their skin colour has nothing to do with it. And then by not acknowledging it, we can't have a conversation, and that conversation can't move forward to create meaningful change, which can save lives as well.
The Interracial Friendship Coordinating Council organised memorial service for Kelso in St Pancras Town Hall where earlier in 1959, Claudia Jones had organised the first London Caribbean Carnival. Claudia was one of the leaders of the IRFCC. One of the key speakers at the event was Eslanda Robson, an African-American civil rights activist, with her husband, the actor Paul Robeson.
So you actually would have learned a little bit about Paul Robeson in the Migration, Empire and People course. He actually acted in a film which was about trying to, in his view, he thought it was about trying to educate people about how Africa was a civilized continent, but then the directors edited it to cut out all of those positive parts and made him look, in their view, as like a savage in the way that they tried to direct it. But he's a very important and powerful civil rights activist, and was also a very close friend of Claudia Jones, which is why he was involved in this so much as well. So he's definitely an individual that I think is really important and worth looking up, just to have a better understanding of civil rights in America, but also that connection with Britain as well. Carry on.
Eslanda declared, "I believe Kelso Cochrane was killed because he was coloured. He died because of racial prejudice and hatred." Being American, Eslanda took Kelso's story into an international struggle against injustice, with thoughts of the murder of Emmett Till in the USA in 1956, a racial murder of a young African-American boy.
Yeah, so those parallels with that, the idea that you've got this connection with the other side of the Atlantic, the idea that you have the civil rights movement in America being so active in the civil rights movement in Britain as well, and those powerful connections. I mean, the fact that on his way to get the Nobel Peace Prize, Martin Luther King stopped off in London to have a meeting with Claudia Jones. The fact that when Claudia Jones died, you have a picture of Malcolm X holding up the West India Gazette in memory of Claudia Jones. So it's interesting how this strong connection with the American civil rights movement, the fact that MLK and Malcolm X looked up to Claudia Jones as a kind of auntie figure, and the fact that we don't talk about that a lot in Britain, even though they were powerful and important people of that time and should be important in our narrative of what is British history. So what was the community response to Kelso Cochrane's death? This is a cemetery which is the closest one to our school, essentially, well, closest Christian one to our school. So let's have a look then. So this is a video which talks about his funeral and the events that happened after his death. So what do we learn about white people in London from the activities that took place after his funeral? And what does it suggest about the overcoming of injustice?
But it was not only black people who were dismayed by the death of Kelso Cochrane. Many local white residents felt that the violence on their streets had to be stopped. Kelso Cochrane's funeral was the chance to show their feelings.
There was the funeral of Kelso Cochrane, which was very much a multiracial funeral, and brought out people from all the different communities to make a show at his funeral, you know, to make a stand against racism. And I think that did have an effect of bringing people together and waking people up to the, you know, what fascists were really up to, what they were like.
I was walking with the crowds, you know. Everybody turned up for that funeral. People were crying all over the place. There were white folks who, from their windows, were hailing the processions when they passed. They were moved. Many of them were quite angry during the funeral, you know, and they were accusing Mosley for it. They were openly shouting that this was a Mosley thing, you know, and had not for Mosley, there would be teddy boys and all that kind of thing was going on.
I think the white community, especially the churches and so on, were a little ashamed at how pathetic their response had been. And I think that people were bewildered and didn't quite know what they should have done, except they hadn't done enough.
After the thing broke out, everybody was assembled in the street chatting about this. you know, and carrying on and discussing it. And, you know, white folks were talking to blacks and that kind of thing, you know.
So what are your thoughts on that then?
Kind of reminds me of Beaker's funeral, in the sense that like masses upon masses turned up to show their respects, and it was an opportunity for empowerment, education. I think, like Giovanna was saying, it was kind of a moral searchlight. Yeah. Yeah.
It also reminds me of Emmett Till's funeral, and how like that became an immediate opportunity for the civil rights movement. Like the fact that he had an open casket, and his casket is still in the museum to this day. And yeah, I think it was a, like Kevin said, an opportunity for empowerment and advancement of the movement, especially in the UK. They really had a movement. And so this could have been like the foundation and beginning of a movement in the UK.
Yeah, seems like it was a rallying point.
Yeah.
Yeah, rallying point, that's a really good phrase to use. And what kind of came out of this as well. So Mosley actually ran for the seat in Kensington in 1959. So he ran as an MP. So what do you think he did? Do you reckon he won that seat? You're nodding your head, Heaven. Why do you think he won?
Just history kind of goes bad, turns bad sometimes, and I feel like this was probably one of those times.
He actually didn't. He lost that seat, and he was disgraced as a result of this. I won't put the clip on, but he lost that seat. He was disgraced, and he ended up just kind of going into the sidelines of politics after that. And I think it's just, this moment is a powerful one because it shows to the white people of Notting Hill, the white people of Kensal Rise, of Brent, and essentially says that silence is violence, in the way that we've been seeing that in the Black Lives Matter movement right now. And it's showing that white people have to be, what we would say right now is they have to be anti-racist in that sense, and not just sit and allow these racist views to be expressed, and to stand with their black community.
No.
So, go on. So then, how far was it a story of injustice? And I think the legacy of the Kelso Cochrane case is incredibly interesting. So what happens is, after a certain amount of time, about 50 years, you have something called the Freedom of Information Act. And what that means is anything that has been written, you have in the public record, you have the right to have access to. So clearly something went wrong in the investigation of Kelso's death. So what we could do as historians is we could go to Kew, we can go to the archives there, and we can pull out the police files and have a look and try and work out what was looked into for the case. Did they use gloves when they were bagging evidence? Did they even look for evidence? So there's a lot of questions that come out with this murder not being solved. But when our friend went to Kew to try and find out, this is what popped up. So these are the police files today. So usually in 50 years you can see them. But what do you notice about this one?
Like 2041. Oh my
They're closed for 72 years.
Well, obviously something dirty was done.
Disappointed but not surprised.
Yeah.
Go on, expand on that, Heaven.
I mean, obviously it's disappointing, it's disgusting. Obviously they're hiding something, deliberately hiding something. But am I really surprised? No, just typical case.
Why not? Why are you not surprised?
Like, I mean, I don't expect anything more from them. Just expectations are that low at this point.
Yeah. And it is, it's tragic. And I think the investigation into Kelso's death would unlock a lot of the questions that we have about race relations in the police today. And by not having access to this information, that's a whole argument that we lose the power to argue as well. So what you're going to do for homework then is you're going to have a look at the British government's response. So we've seen about what the judiciary, so what the judges have said about it, what their response has been. You've seen the law enforcement response. But what did the British government do in response to the bubbling racial tensions of the UK? So we talked about the Notting Hill riots. You also had riots in Nottingham as well. So they weren't exclusive to just London. So in the folder on the homework doc, you will find a link to the government response and a story about one of the people who were affected by this response as well.